morning. I'm Zedrad Al-Hussein, the President and CEO of the International Peace Institute, and I have the great privilege of opening this discussion on safeguarding humanitarian action in counterterrorism context, addressing the challenges of the next decade, along with His Excellency Ambassador Christoph Heusgen of Germany, and welcoming you all to it, and thanking Ambassador Heusgen for Germany's support and also the support that we've drawn from Belgium, Canada, Ireland, Spain, and Switzerland. This is an official side event of the so-called Counterterrorism Week, taking place in the margins, or on the margins of the second high-level conference of heads of counterterrorism agencies of member states. And it was initially organized to analyze the updated text of the 7th review of the global counterterrorism strategy. The revised version of the GA resolution may be adopted this afternoon. And we still believe, though, that the discussion merits a further interrogation by this wonderful collection of experts we have on the panel today. The dilemma is clear. Humanitarian needs are ballooning, continue to balloon, while counterterrorism approaches a priority for all member states and the UN, unless calibrated and with precision, could well create a chilling effect on humanitarian action, the criminalization of humanitarian assistance, etc. So I would like to, before turning the floor over to Ambassador Heusgen, I'd like to raise 3 questions for the panelists, and then, of course, provide the floor for Ambassador Heusgen to set the stage. But how can UN member states and the UN counterterrorism architecture continue to address transnational threats while ensuring they can address increasing humanitarian needs? How could the UN system's response to humanitarian action and counterterrorism be more coherent? What are the practical impediments to the comprehensive or to a comprehensive response guided by protection? And if the GCTS resolution is adopted later today, how does the GCTS updated language on humanitarian action encourage and allow for safeguarding humanitarian action in the counterterrorism context? With that, I would be, I'm happy, and I would be remiss if I didn't again thank Ambassador Heusgen, but I'm delighted now to hand the floor over to him. Ambassador, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Zaid, and thanks very much for organizing this very important event. This is my last week here in New York and last week as a PR. And I hope for your understanding, I have to leave because I have another event to attend to. But for me, it was very important to participate in today's meeting because I think I can say now in retrospect with regard to the last 4 years that the safeguarding of the humanitarian space has been at the forefront of our activities. It has been a key priority for us here at the mission, and also my own. One key moment, and some of you may remember this, was when our Foreign Minister Heiko Maas, together with his French counterpart Yves Le Drian, when they presented the humanitarian call for action in September 2019, an initiative that was endorsed by 48 member states as of today, and also endorsed by the European Union. And this call for action contained a very important element to with regard to our discussion today. The ministers, 48 countries, urged the Security Council to establish legally binding language that would exclude principled humanitarian actors from the reach of sanctions. So that was the ambition. We in 2019 had a seat in the Security Council. but I have to admit that the political landscape did not allow for the necessary political will to have a breakthrough in this respect. We need, and I know I talked to the converted, but we need sanction regimes that allow the or ask the compliance officers around the world to work with humanitarian actors. We need sanctions regimes that clearly counter the dangers of de-risking, in particular by the financial sector, by service providers like shipping companies. It's unfortunate, but to a certain degree, it's also understandable that the private sector is cautious when they are afraid that possible sanctions violations could lead to a criminal responsibility. Zaid, in your introduction, you said it, the criminalization of humanitarian assistance. And this is something that we have to really work, or I admit we were not able to achieve this. I think the Council needs to keep this on the agenda, needs to provide clear rules and languages. I know how it is difficult, but I think we have to push for it. We think that there could be standard language in individual sanctions regimes, in resolutions that allow for the effective protection of humanitarian space, and we should continue to work with players in the Security Council to provide for this. We have one example. We took a step into this direction in March 2019 with Resolution 2462 on countering the financing of terrorism. There was at least some protective language with regard to humanitarian actors incorporated. Not everybody was happy, and including those who negotiated this. It might not be the best possible provision, but we think it was a start. And we believe, and coming to the GCTS, Zaid, that it provides good language for further steps, but still the Security Council, it was coming back to the resolution was a start. But we know the UN moves, Security Council moves at, or in general moves at snail's pace, and I'm afraid that the topic of today will remain on the agenda, will still make the list of challenges for the next decade. And there will be always setbacks. The GCTS debates showed that there is always this risk for setbacks. So we need to make sure that the view that the CT aims to counter, that they want to overrule the humanitarian principle, this must not prevail. That the logic which you hear very often from prominent countries, that the cause of counterterrorism justifies any means in failing to protect those who need protection most. This is not something that we can accept. Counterterrorism, of course, is a legitimate tool to protect the public and ensure public safety, but not at any cost. And when a listed terrorist organization like Al-Shabaab in the south of Somalia is in control of a region of population, it is impossible for humanitarian actors not to interact with individuals that are associated with this group. And there we have to have clear rules for this, because one cannot turn one's back on the people suffering under in a humanitarian crisis, suffer under terrorist threats, but we have to be able to provide them with humanitarian support. So the discussion around the GCTS, and that you mentioned this again demonstrated how important it is that strong voices speak out for humanitarian space. These need to come from member states, they need to come from academia, they need to come from civil society. And I think that also today's event will strengthen these voices, and from this meeting also new impulses can be sent to shape tomorrow's policy. So again, thanks Zaid for picking this up. Thanks, I see my colleagues there from Belgium, Canada, Ireland, Spain, Switzerland. This is a common enterprise, and I'm very grateful to my colleagues who have also joined us. We are in this here together. Back to you.
Great, thanks so much, Ambassador. And let me just, as you wind down your time in New York, thank you again for your consistent cooperation with and support to IPI. It's very much been appreciated, and no doubt your presence will be missed and your absence felt by all of us in the UN community. You talked about ways that we might be able to continue to make incremental progress to safeguard principled humanitarian action. So I'm going to turn to our panel. I'm going to introduce our three speakers who are going to talk to us exactly about how we might be able to do that. So our first panelist today is Ms. Laetitia Courtois, the permanent observer to the United Nations and head of delegation for the International Committee of the Red Cross. She'll be followed by our second speaker, Professor Naz Modir-Zadeh, the founding director of the Harvard Law School Program on International Law and Armed Conflict. And then our third speaker, Dr. Jahangir Khan, the director of the UN Counterterrorism Center and of the Office of Counterterrorism at the UN. So with that, Laetitia, let me turn things over to you to start us off, please.
Good. Thank you very much, Zaid and Jake, and thank you also to the IPI team, including Agathe, for all the hard work in organizing this important event, which brings us to contemplate what better safeguards for humanitarian action might look like over the next 10 years. So I've been asked to address three questions in my remarks. The first one to give an overview on how UN counterterrorism provision impact our field of activities. The second, how views on the most recent GCTS language, and finally, how can the Global Compact and the UN Security Council best support the humanitarian action. But at the outset, let me stress really that all states have every right to take measures to protect their citizens from acts of terrorism, which includes attacks against civilians in armed conflict, prohibited as a war crime. So terrorism runs counter to the fundamental principle of humanity. That being said, counterterrorism measures, however, continue to negatively affect our work and our operation in certain ways. And in answer to the first question, and here I would like to highlight 5 elements. The first one, the national criminal city legislation often enacted to ensure compliance with the United Nations resolutions limits what we can do in the field. These laws often include a broad definition and interpretation of support or assistance to terrorism, which restricts our ability to interact with the affected population, primarily in the areas of assistance, but also in protection activities such as detention visits. CT and related sanction regimes that are very broad might prevent any form of economic support to persons or entities where armed groups are active. And those CT laws may also prevent the ICRC from training opposition group on the laws of war, which we find can reduce the likelihood of violations. The second element is that clauses in funding agreements that condition the release of the fund on strict compliance with CT measures have in practice prevented the ICRC from carrying out activities in opposition-controlled areas. And yet these are areas where people are often the most in need of assistance. A third element is also that CT measures have resulted in over-compliance and de-risking policy by the private sectors, as highlighted by Ambassador Erksen. As a result, supply companies and banks are reluctant to provide services to humanitarian organizations, and this renders more difficult and more time-consuming our capacity to deliver assistance. A fourth element is that national CT-related travel restrictions may also prevent flights for emergency medical cares or the organization of meeting with representative of non-state parties to armed conflict designated as terrorists or included on sanctioned list in third countries. A positive element, however, to mention here is important. In 2017, the EU Counterterrorism Directive contains wording exempting certain humanitarian organizations recognized by international law from its scope. This directive was adopted some 9 months ago after the 5th CTS review in 2016. First included more protective humanitarian language in operative paragraph 69. In addition, the UN Security Council Resolution 2462, as also mentioned earlier, and its operative paragraphs 5, 6, and 24 have been key in persuading some states to include humanitarian carve-outs in their criminal CT legislation. On the second question, this is one of a bit more delicate to answer for 2 reasons. First, I'm speaking at the same event with one of the co-facilitators of the GCTS, Ambassador Santos Maraver, who has had the challenging task of getting states to reach consensus on a resolution that counts some 166 paragraphs only. Second, as I speak, the GCTS has not yet officially been adopted to my knowledge, and that will allow me, therefore, to highlight 3 areas in which the ICRC has had discussion with the UN member state related to the GCTS. First, we have sought to retain previous gains in the protection of humanitarian action, including in relation to medical services and activities, and to strengthen them where possible. And relevant to these efforts are the paragraphs 79 and 80 of the 2018 review. Second, we have sought language protecting children in armed conflict, including in relation to education and possible criminal sanctions. In particular, we have sought to have children treated primarily as victims, to look at the best interest of those child when carrying out individual assessment of their case, and to consider non-judicial outcomes to their situation. And the third element is also that we have sought to obtain references to strong language on detention, including allowing family contact, avoiding incommunicado detention, and ensuring respect for international standards of treatment and conditions of detention, as well as respect for international humanitarian law. Finally, and to answer briefly on the third question, what could we envisage in the coming decade to best support humanitarian action? Ideally, the UN counterterrorism framework should be revisited to ensure better respect for international humanitarian law. This includes re-examining how counterterrorism measures affect humanitarian access, detention visits, assistance, including medical activities, and IHL training. The ICRC's contact with non-state armed groups mandated by the universally ratified Geneva Conventions and by the additional protocols should not be made a crime. And rather, respect for Article 70 of the Additional Protocol 1 requires parties to allow and facilitate the work of international and impartial humanitarian organizations. Progressively, we would like to see CT language in the Security Council resolution to include an obligation on states to take measures to allow and facilitate the work of impartial humanitarian organizations in armed conflict, building on the OP 24 of Resolution 2462. The existing standing well-crafted humanitarian carve-outs reflecting IHL should be adopted by states in their domestic laws. Then, depending on how successful this is in practice, specific further steps could be envisaged, including such exemptions generally at the UN and elsewhere. These changes relate to legal obligations that are above and beyond other steps that should be taken to better respect revised recommendation 8 of the Financial Action Task Force to not disrupt legitimate civil society more broadly, including outside armed conflicts. And it must be possible to carry out counterterrorism measures on the one hand, and on the other hand, allow humanitarian organizations to help civilians in armed conflict on the other. And those two sets of principles are not mutually exclusive and should not contradict each other. The recent legislation in countries such as Chad, Ethiopia, the Netherlands, Switzerland, and the Philippines prove this is possible. The recent United States general licenses regarding medical activities related to COVID-19 in 3 contexts, and the broader general licenses related to Myanmar and Yemen earlier this year prove also this is possible. United Nations Somalia sanction regime involving an organization listed by some states as terrorist proves that a humanitarian exception is possible. And our ability to reach impacted population in Somalia prove that such an exemption works to facilitate principled humanitarian action while still allowing states to fight terrorism. So we look forward to working with states, compact entities, and others to better ensure safeguards over the coming decades. Thank you very much, Jake. Over to you.
Nitisha, thanks so much. Naz, let me turn things over to you now, please.
Thank you very much, Jake. I wanted to thank IPI and the permanent missions of Germany, Belgium, Canada, Ireland, Spain, and Switzerland for convening today's event. I'm really honored to take part in this important conversation. Over the next few minutes, I'll draw on our program's recent research in seeking to help frame some of the core issues that we're discussing today, and to suggest 2 steps that member states can take to help promote respect for principled humanitarian action in counterterrorism contexts. I will focus on such contexts that also qualify as armed conflicts under international law. My core message is that a growing global counterterrorism architecture is increasingly predominating in practice over principled humanitarian action. If the current trajectory continues, 2 possibilities seem likely to come to pass over the next decade that our hosts have asked us to address. One is that counterterrorism measures may further constrain the practical scope of impartial humanitarian activities. A second is that an ever-expanding counterterrorism system will ultimately redefine what constitutes legitimate humanitarian activities. To effectively safeguard principled humanitarian action through 2031, states must anticipate and address these potential developments now. A key contextual point that I wanted to mention is that each year, more and more responsibilities for safeguarding principled humanitarian action are being reposed not in states or humanitarian agencies, but in anti-terrorism bodies, especially at the Security Council and its sub-entities tasked with countering terrorism. Further, the vast majority of new binding multilateral counterterrorism obligations, recommendations, and the like are being developed behind closed doors. From my perspective, states need to own these issues. And in doing so, states should subject these developments to much greater public scrutiny. Further displacing these authorities to international bodies of limited membership and their bureaucratic security entities risks undermining state sovereignty and diminishing states' responsibility for developing and interpreting international law. In this environment, 2 sets of measures, I believe, would help address the core challenges to safeguarding humanitarian action in counterterrorism contexts. First, states and other international actors ought to develop and implement more concrete measures to uphold respect for existing IHL protections for principled humanitarian action. That includes securing respect for foundational IHL rules, even and perhaps indeed especially where the protections pertain to people characterized as terrorists. This would mean, in short, taking the steps necessary across all relevant state agencies and organs to respect the humanitarian imperative, to facilitate humanitarian services, and to ensure that ethically sound medical care is never punished. It would also require states to call on other states to respect IHL. As part of those efforts, states may need to assert that certain definitions of terrorist conduct are illegitimate because they sweep in justifiable, even morally required activities, including the provision of impartial humanitarian services under IHL. States' responsibility for respecting and ensuring respect for IHL demands nothing less than taking these internal and external measures, as well as exercising scrutiny over counterterrorism bodies tasked with relevant mandates. If I can state one of the underlying issues quite plainly, some states evidently continue to conceive of some humanitarian and medical services, including activities protected under IHL, as constituting illegitimate support to terrorists. This approach, which apparently some UN CT bodies have also adopted, represents, from my perspective, both a conflict with existing legal obligations and a non-acceptance of the values underlying principled humanitarian action. In this context, states may wish to ask themselves who is and who ought to be in a position to authentically and authoritatively interpret and apply IHL where it overlaps with counterterrorism. So far as our research team has uncovered, there has been little to no public discourse, at least among states, as to whether counterterrorism entities ought to be tasked with engaging substantive questions of IHL and perhaps even assessing states' IHL compliance in this area. Nor, so far as we are aware, and despite applicable UN Security Council resolutions, have any states publicly elaborated their views regarding the modalities to interpret IHL as it may relate to relevant Security Council counterterrorism mandates. Safeguarding humanitarian action in counterterrorism context arguably requires tackling these issues head on. As a second step, states ought to question and contest broader constraints on impartial humanitarian activities arising out of counterterrorism rationales. Respect for impartial humanitarian activities is increasingly being framed in terms of whether those services comport with the counterterrorism architecture. In the process, some pillars of impartial humanitarian activities are at risk of political, legal, and even cultural erosion. Currently, the humanitarian community seeks to devise workarounds to safeguard as many of their services as possible in counterterrorism contexts, as we've heard about. Seeking to support those initiatives, states may advocate for carve-outs for humanitarian activities from CT measures as a technical solution. From my perspective, such efforts, which of course may be warranted and salutary, need to be understood within a much broader framework. That is because without this context, those technical level efforts, even if partly successful, paper over bigger fault lines. It is time to articulate and enact a more comprehensive, more values-driven notion of peace and security, one that elevates respect for principled humanitarian action. States and other international actors therefore ought to recenter and ground respect for impartial humanitarian activities as an urgently necessary objective in itself, not one refracted through a counterterrorism lens. Recent weeks have once again demonstrated that states are keen to devise strategies, enact policies, and allocate funding to counterterrorism. Yet new laws, policies, and institutions aimed first and foremost at securing respect for the humanitarian imperative are relatively rare indeed. Amid unprecedented global humanitarian needs, it is time to boldly and unflinchingly protect the humanitarian initiative. Both of these steps will require consistent and concerted efforts, especially by member states. To be certain, UN system actors will have a role to play. But from my perspective, the necessary change cannot come solely or even mainly from UN entities, humanitarian organizations, or counterterrorism bodies. These matters require state action. Thanks very much for your attention, and I very much look forward to the discussion.
Thanks so much, Naz. I think your final point is, in a way, a good transition. I mean, you emphasize the critical, if not the primary role that states need to address in addressing these issues. But as you said, the UN system actors also have a role to play. And we're next going to hear from Jahangir to provide the perspective from at least part of that UN architecture. Jahangir, please.
Well, thank you very much. Well, I'd like to begin by thanking IPI, in particular my good friend Zaid Rad Hussein and you, Jake Sherman, for the invitation to participate in this virtual policy forum, as well as, of course, the permanent mission of Germany for its co-sponsorship with the IPI, and the missions of Belgium, Canada, Ireland, Spain, and Switzerland to the UN. I'd like to also acknowledge my fellow panelists, in particular Ambassador Christoph Hüstchen, Permanent Representative of Germany, Ms. Laetitia Courtois, and Professor Naz Modrizadeh. I'm very glad to be with you all. In recent years, the issue of preserving humanitarian space in counterterrorism has continued to be of concern and a great challenge to the international community. Terrorist activity continues to cause displacement and endless human suffering, leaving humanitarian actors on the ground, caught between terrorist actions and government counterterrorism operations. The IPI and its co-sponsors are doing a great service, in my opinion, to us all by highlighting a topic that is timely and extremely relevant. IPI has posed 4 very important questions that it has asked me to address, and which is relevant to the discussion on counterterrorism and the prevention of violent extremism. First of all, how has our UN Office of Counterterrorism supported the implementation of the UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy's provisions related to safeguarding humanitarian action since the inclusion of relevant language in the 2016 Global Counterterrorism Strategy review across programs in the Global Counterterrorism Compact? Secondly, what is our UN Counterterrorism Center capacity building program doing to support the preservation of humanitarian action in counterterrorism contexts? Thirdly, how is our UN Counterterrorism Center coordinating in the field with other UN presences, including UN country teams, humanitarian agencies in relation to safeguarding humanitarian activities? And finally, how is our UN Counterterrorism Center addressing its evolving role on safeguarding humanitarian action in counterterrorism contexts? So as a starting point, I'd like to recall that the UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy that was adopted by consensus in 2006 by the UN General Assembly was in fact the first time all member states agreed to a common strategic and operational approach to fighting terrorism, despite the fact that we're bedeviled by the absence of an agreed definition of terrorism until to this very day. The strategy is a unique global instrument that aims to enhance national, regional, and international counterterrorism efforts across all its 4 pillars. And whilst its 4th pillar ensures respect for human rights and the rule of law as a fundamental basis for the fight against terrorism, unfortunately, there is no specific provision in the strategy, or I should say pillar, that is focused on exclusively humanitarian issues. So building on the strategy's spirit of a common strategic approach, in 2016, the UN Secretary General launched the United Nations Plan to prevent violent extremism, seeking to address the underlying conditions that drive individuals to radicalize and join violent extremist groups. Notably, the plan calls for better cooperation and enhanced coherence across security, sustainable development, human rights, and humanitarian assistance. It specifically states, and I quote, humanitarian actors must have the necessary space within which to operate, and that our humanitarian work is people-centered, supports resilient communities, and does not fuel conflict, end of quote. The importance of safeguarding humanitarian actors was echoed in the fifth review of the strategy in 2016, which called, and I'll quote, states to ensure whenever international humanitarian law is applicable, that counterterrorism legislation and measures do not impede humanitarian and medical activities or engagement with all relevant actors as foreseen by international humanitarian law, end of quote. Earlier this year, 2021, the Secretary General's latest update report on the activities of the UN system in implementing the UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy highlighted the importance of enabling principled humanitarian action, stating, and I quote, "It is vital that counterterrorism measures do not prevent the effective delivery of principled humanitarian aid." And in the recently concluded draft of the seventh review UN General Assembly resolution that is in front of the General Assembly as we speak and will hopefully be adopted either today or in the coming days, this latest UNGA resolution, which has been carefully negotiated by member states, once again affirms the importance of seeking concrete solutions to mitigate the potential negative impacts of counterterrorism legislation and measures on impartial humanitarian action and civil society, and are reminded of their responsibility to ensure that countering financing of terrorism measures comply with international law, including human rights and international humanitarian law, and consider their potential effect on exclusively humanitarian activities. The draft resolution, which appears to have wide support amongst member states, is quite encouraging and a move in the right direction. To this end, our UN Office of Counterterrorism, as the Secretariat of the United Nations Global Counterterrorism Compact, facilitates improved coordination of UN programs and activities across 43 UN and non-UN entities that form the Compact, which in fact is the largest coordination framework in the United Nations system. Through, in particular, the Working Group of the on Human Rights, Rule of Law, and Victims of Terrorism, which is co-chaired by our UN Office of Counterterrorism and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, as well as the Global Compact Working Group on Criminal Justice, Legal Responses, and Countering the Financing of Terrorism, which is co-chaired by our office. This group coordinates UN action system-wide on issues that touch on humanitarian action in counterterrorism context. In the Counterterrorism Compact Working Group on Human Rights, the Rule of Law, and Victims, we focus on common concerns, such as efforts to mainstream human rights in counterterrorism, PCV efforts, and we believe that this includes enabling principled humanitarian action. The best way to preserve humanitarian crisis, to prevent humanitarian crises in counterterrorism context is to consistently safeguard human rights in the CT PCV space. For example, our UN Office of Counterterrorism, in partnership with the Office of High Commissioner of Human Rights, is producing a publication on ensuring human rights at borders, including for migrants and refugees, and on implementing a project on human rights and the use of artificial intelligence in PCV context. I'd like to highlight some of our flagship programs that specifically support the preservation of humanitarian efforts in counterterrorism. Firstly, the global framework to support, for the United Nations support on Syria and Iraq third country national returnees, developed and implemented in partnership with UNICEF and 13 other UN humanitarian entities, provides an all of UN response to address the needs of member states to ensure human rights-based, age and gender sensitive protection, repatriation, prosecution, rehabilitation, and reintegration of foreign nationals returning from Syria and Iraq who may have alleged or actual links or family ties to designated terrorist groups. Repatriations have been complicated by COVID-19, but the global framework will be formally launched on the margins of the current General Assembly this September. Secondly, the United Nations Victims of Support Program, launched in 2018 to provide practical support and advocacy to victims and their family, some of whom are in dire need of humanitarian assistance. UN Office of Counterterrorism, in partnership with UNODC and IPU, are in the final stages of producing a set of model legal provisions for the protection of victims of terrorism, a tool to help member states to provide a legal basis for the protection of the rights of victims, provision of humanitarian and other support, and the amplification of their voices as part of a holistic counterterrorism action in support of the thousands of victims of terrorism across the world. Thirdly, the UN Office of Counterterrorism continues its efforts to strengthen its engagement with civil society. We have established a dedicated unit on civil society engagement and developed a strategy to involve civil society organizations, including women and youth-led organizations in counterterrorism PCV programs and projects, as well as policy leadership activities. Also, in response to the General Assembly in Resolution 284, the UN Office of Counterterrorism Center, under the leadership of the Deputy Secretary General, we held a series of dialogues with civil society organizations from around the world and conducted a survey to collect input from civil society on how to implement the global counterterrorism strategy more effectively. Fourthly, the UN Office of Counterterrorism is taking steps to augment and strengthen the gender and human rights mandate through the development of integrated global programs for both a HRDDP, a human rights due diligence policy, SOP, a gender policy and action plan, and other initiatives. And finally, in response to the Security Council Resolution 2462 of 2019, calling on the UN Office of Counterterrorism to enhance coordination on delivering integrated technical assistance on counterterrorism financing measures, the UN Office of Counterterrorism launched its UN Global Program on countering financing of terrorism. At its core is a recognition of the need for all member states to enhance efforts on countering financing of terrorism and protect human rights and principled humanitarian action. The program supports the preservation of humanitarian action in counterterrorism contexts by building much needed national and regional capacity on the protection of the non-profit sector from terrorist abuse. In carrying out the counterterrorism mandate, we coordinate closely with the UN country teams on the ground, humanitarian partners, for example, in Burkina Faso, in the Philippines, and in Iraq, with civil society organizations as well. Our closest partners are the UN resident coordinators on the ground, UNICEF, OHCHR, the Office of Coordination of OCHA, which is responsible for humanitarian affairs, in consultation with other humanitarian actors like IOM and OHCHR in the development and implementation of capacity building activities. Through a network of country offices, the UN Office of Counterterrorism Center brings its activities closer to the beneficiaries and works more efficiently with partners, including humanitarian actors in the counterterrorism and PCV space. In the Philippines, for example, the UN Office of Counterterrorism, in partnership with the resident coordinator in Manila and other counterterrorism entities of the UN, has developed a joint program on human rights for the country. In Iraq, our staff works closely with the UNAMI Human Rights Unit to facilitate programs jointly implemented by UNOCT, OHCHR, and other UN entities. The global framework is being implemented in Central Asia in partnership with the resident coordinators and UN country teams on the ground.
Jahangir, sorry. Could I ask you to wind up, and then
yes,
maybe hopefully some of the, if there are other specific examples, we could also cover those in the discussion, but I make sure that we've got time for the discussion.
Okay, very good. Let me just conclude by saying, apologies for the long length, let me just say that we must not lose sight for the fact that the ultimate responsibility to protect humanitarian space while exercising counterterrorism measures remains with member states. And in this regard, international cooperation to support respect for the rule of law, human rights, and humanitarian refugee law remains paramount. And so looking ahead, our focus remains in the improvement of member states' record and action in human rights and counterterrorism PCV efforts, including the impact on humanitarian actors and human rights defenders. Thank you again, and I look forward to the discussion.
Jahangir, thank you so much. I'm going to ask everybody that's watching, if you have questions, you can drop them into the Q&A function in Zoom. You can also, I believe, use the raise your hand function. We'll call on audience members if you have comments and questions in a moment. We have about, let's say, 35 minutes, perhaps 40 minutes for what I hope will be an interactive discussion, and then I'm going to give the floor to His Excellency Ambassador Augustin Santos Maravej for concluding remarks. But maybe before turning to the audience, if I could start off with a question of my own, which is, in circumstances where UN Security Council language may differ from international humanitarian law, whether customary law or the Geneva Conventions, how should this be resolved? And in particular, given the emphasis on the role of member states in today's discussion, how can member states best ensure the compatibility of UN Security Council resolutions and IHL in the future? And I guess there's both a legal aspect in terms of how to resolve tensions between IHL and council resolutions, but of course also the political issue of whether indeed one sees a tension there. So maybe let me turn to the panel for initial thoughts on that, and hopefully our audience members can think over questions, and we'll turn to them in a moment. So no compulsion, but Letitia, Naz, Jahangir, if you have thoughts on how to resolve that tension, that would be most appreciated. Maybe in the order of speaking. Letitia?
Thank you, Jake, for the question. Well, definitely the tension exists, and it's a lot of interpretation and understanding as well of how this trickles down into the debates and the discussion at stake. For us, it's important that any Security Council resolution that touches upon the issue of counterterrorism keeps the mention of must comply with international humanitarian law, to make sure that the reference is explicit, but also to ensure that the substance as well will be referred as in a consistent manner and a standard manner, rather than being something that needs to be understood or assumed. We also need to make sure that any resolution of the Security Council will include as well the allow and facilitate humanitarian action in any text that they will adopt, and make sure that this also goes beyond the take into account type of expression that we've seen from 2019. Over to you.
Thanks, Letitia. Naz, do you want to come in with any thoughts?
Sure, thanks, Jake. So I think just building on what Letitia just said, I think one is the Security Council has demanded compliance with relevant and applicable international humanitarian law. So first, I would say where states are being pressured or are getting the political sense that there is a tension or a conflict between what is being demanded from CT entities or even from the kinds of compliance assessments that Jahangir referred to, I think their first port of call is to say, this is our understanding of the strict interpretation and implementation of international humanitarian law, which we are applying in reference not only to our existing legal obligations, but also in the context of the Security Council resolution. And second, I think just amplifying what Letitia said, this is often going to be playing out in the arena of interpretation, as opposed to kind of very stark or clear conflicts in exact doctrine. And so it's there that I think states really would benefit from strengthening their analysis of the areas where IHL intersects and interacts with CT, and also thinking about whether or not they are prepared to share the responsibility of interpreting compliance with IHL with CT bodies. Thanks.
Thanks, Naz. Jahangir, anything to add on this?
No, I would only, I agree with the previous two colleagues. The only thing I would say on this is that, as we all know, the resolution of the Security Council are always a compromise and sometimes a rather lower common denominator in order to get consensus. And obviously, the clearer and more explicit the language, quite often IHL is not even in the operative paragraph. And so, there is, I think, a need for continued advocacy for more clarity and more specificity and making sure that IHL is not just a sort of add-on, but is very much more clear and specific, because otherwise the issue of interpretation, it leaves a great measure of ambiguity, and as a result, I think the humanitarian space suffers. So it really comes down ultimately to improving the emphasis and quality of Security Council resolutions, which is easier said than done, as we all know. But I think continued advocacy and for more clarity, particularly in the operative paragraphs where it's most relevant, is extremely important. Thank you.
Thanks, Jahangir. We've got a question in from the audience. How are sanctions harming the safeguarding of humanitarian action? Letitia, you spoke a little bit about this in your remarks, but maybe to add to that, the very use of the term safeguards is one that we see coming up with increased frequency, and yet there are different understandings of what that term actually means. So I would be interested in hearing from the panelists if you have thoughts on what safeguards for humanitarian action are, whether they're examples or good practices related to safeguards, whether in the context of specific Security Council resolutions or in their national implementation. Letitia, could I turn to you? Thanks.
Yeah, yes, thank you, Jake. We definitely talk about safeguard for action, but also for our own staff and our capacity to deliver on the field. It goes from many examples. One comes to mind is how we can protect our own colleagues from any possible legal pursuit and criminalization of their activities in the frame of their professional capacities. And we unfortunately have had examples of colleagues in the ICRC that have been arrested and judged for carrying their duties with us, with the humanitarian organization in conflict settings, because national legislation will criminalize any contact or work that would be seen in favor of a population or a specific non-state armed group in a direct or indirect way. We also see very generally as well, beyond our colleagues, medical personnel that are criminalized as well when carrying or trying to carry out their duties, doctors that are arrested, nurses, and the huge dilemma that it imposes on them, what to prioritize their ethical responsibilities and their duty of care or respecting the law as well. So it's those safeguards that we talk about on our side. We also need to be able to carry our activities in favor of people living in areas by non-state armed groups, and those activities can go from assisting the population with all sorts of assistance response to visiting the people that are detained in those areas, and therefore probably and possibly engage in further discussion related to release of detainees, better treatment of detainees, exchange of detainees as well, at times where we are also engaging ourselves as a neutral humanitarian organization, and also bringing clear water to those places, bringing the items that they need to be to have pipes repaired without the suspicion that we're bringing assistance to of dual use, but actually really meant for the population that has to respond to those needs, or even repairing hospitals as well. just a mention as well. It's when we talk about people living in non-state armed groups controlled areas, we talk about 60 million. So it's an evaluation, of course, that is indicative of the number of people that could be affected as well and are affected indirectly by our limitation and capacity in reaching out to them and supporting them in those difficult moments. So this is also an information, a number to also keep in mind to understand the broad need of those people that we try to respond to in the best way, while also being very conscious as well of the risk that we might encounter in the carrying our duties.
Thanks, Letitia. Let's see. Again, a call out to anyone who has a question or a comment to use the Q&A function in Zoom. We can either read it out or have you read it out yourselves. Maybe, I think my sense is up until this point, most and actually maybe all UN Security Council resolutions and even the language in UN General Assembly resolutions pertaining to humanitarian action refers to situations where IHL applies to situations of armed conflict. I'd be interested in hearing what that means for humanitarian action, or what the implications are for humanitarian action outside of situations of armed conflict, if any of you have thoughts on that. Maybe not.
Sure, Jake, I can step in on this, sure. Yeah, I mean, just to say, so I don't want to say the advantage of armed conflict, but the framing of armed conflict, of course, is what allows us to bring in the language of IHL, right? So when we talk about humanitarian action in armed conflict, this is the discussion we've been having for the last decade about the protections enshrined in IHL, and then CT provisions or discourses or institutions that may challenge that. I think outside of situations of armed conflict, including in development contexts, the challenge is in fact far more stark, because we lack that clear treaty-based and customary international law-based protection for humanitarian action. We are reliant much more on discourses of policy, of practice, of good donorship approaches. And while those are, of course, strong and important and reflect a great deal of consensus on the part of the international community, my view is that in some ways, humanitarian activities and life-saving activities in contexts outside of armed conflict and even development environments may be far, far more susceptible to counterterrorism overreach, because we don't have that context of IHL that applies.
Letitia, please.
Yes, thank you, Jake. And I definitely agree with Naz on those remarks. I think it's also interesting to see where we are working concretely, and some situations are very clear-cut, and we can very comfortably refer to IHL, and some others are definitely not that clear, and definitely situation where, for instance, violence, certain level of violence are happening, bring also another type of discussion on how to protect the people as well, and how to refer to. Maybe I'll just come back to the comment on the recommendation 8 of the Financial Action Task Force. That is definitely a good start to build upon, and which mentioned not to disrupt legitimate civil society more broadly, including outside armed areas of armed conflict. So those are definitely a good basis for more protection for the people in those not so clear-cut contexts. Thank you.
Thanks, Letitia. Jahangir, anything you'd like to add on this? I do have a question specifically for you as well that I was hoping you might weigh in on. But first, to see if you wanted to come in on this last question.
No, I think you hit on a very, very key question. Clearly the ambiguity, and I think as our colleagues on the panel also highlighted, I mean, this clearly enables, the ambiguity clearly enables, broad interpretation in some cases, particularly in very complex counterterrorism operations. So I think this is definitely a gray area. And in my opinion, and I've been listening very carefully, we are now in the business of helping develop model legal provisions. As I've explained to you, we've done a lot of work on the victims front. I think this is the sort of lacunae that we need to broadly address, throughout the UN system, where we need to help member states address these issues more directly. And we need to try to reduce this type of ambiguous, because that's exactly where I think, we're challenged. And I think if legislations domestically of member states are not well articulated in that sense, I don't think one can adapt. One could or one couldn't, it depends. IHL provisions in the context of armed conflict, whereas in counterterrorism context, I think there needs to be much more work done in this front. So, I think this is a question that definitely needs to be further reflected on and worked on. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jahangir. One question I was hoping you might weigh in on. There's, of course, a growing body of binding international law coming out of Security Council resolutions that exists alongside resolutions from other bodies, including from the General Assembly. What is the approach that the Office of Counterterrorism takes when there are differences in often very subtle nuances between the language, and yet you have essentially two sets of legislation that need to be concurrently implemented? So I'd be interested in hearing how the UN's own counterterrorism legislation grapples with some of the tensions and nuances between the various resolutions that are out there. Maybe a second question to all of you, as we look at the months to come, whether you see upcoming opportunities for member states at the UN to clarify safeguards on humanitarian action. So Jahangir, maybe let me start with you, and we could work backwards if Naz and Letitia want to come in on either of those questions, particularly the second one, I guess. Please.
Yeah, I mean, again, you've touched on a very delicate and important question. I mean, quite frankly, the General Assembly resolutions, and they're mostly like the one that we're right now in front of the General Assembly, is of course, they are more all-encompassing. They're focused on GCTS review, and they're in many cases, specifically in this area, as I quoted some language, it's rather broad sweeping and rather vague. It doesn't lend itself, in the way that Security Council resolutions, which are adopted on very specific issues, like, for example, you were mentioning on the FATF on countering financing terrorism. So in a sense, we don't always see the tension that you speak of, because there is the GA resolutions are essentially on counterterrorism, adopted in a broad framework every 2 years. And the Security Council, of course, meets throughout the year and, adopts very specific legislation. In my opinion, in fact, helps because, of course, one shouldn't generalize, but there's much more focus on the specific issue at stake, and where there is language related to humanitarian human rights issues. I do think that is definitely, as we've discussed earlier, needs to be strengthened. But we don't, in our day-to-day work, perceive the kind of tension that you might expect, as you were saying. We see that quite often, because Security Council, of course, of that Chapter 7 resolutions, and most CT resolutions of the Security Council are Chapter 7. They are, of course, very much more specific and more demanding, and including in terms of how they direct us. So we are guided when it comes to implementing resolutions in terms of specific issues really by Security Council, and don't necessarily perceive that kind of tension, which could be, as you say, but hasn't really affected our work so far.
Naz, do you want to weigh in on this?
Sure. Maybe I'll weigh in on the second question, if just
Please.
to make sure I understood it correctly, about kind of what are the sort of opportunities that may arise further this year.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I think in some ways, I'm really grateful that we have the sort of range of perspectives that we do here, and I think in some ways Jahangir lays out for us one vision about how to safeguard humanitarian action, in which is that we have more mushrooming of CT entities, more coordination, more acronyms, and that we pour more resources into the idea that as CT expands its footprint, it also should ensure that humanitarian action is part of what it is doing, and laudably so and genuinely so. And I think that is one way to think about the further opportunities that will be before the council this year, is that model is the approach. Expand CT, but make it more humanitarian friendly. I think another approach is quite the opposite, which is to question whether we have perhaps gone too far, whether perhaps that footprint has grown too large and has overtaken areas where candidly CT does not belong. And to, in fact, approach the opportunities that remain in this year, the 20th anniversary of the September 11th attacks, to bring back, to constrain, to limit, and to ask whether or not a better way to secure humanitarian action and the humanitarian imperative is to do so independently and outside of the context of the CT framework.
Letitia, did you want to come in? Yeah, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Jake. And yeah, once again, I definitely agree with Naz on the comments on this to this second question. Definitely, we need to see, and we hope to see, a pendulum moving a little bit more in a different direction, and to and hopefully see that not all counterterrorism mentions are positive, and needs to consider, of course, the negative consequences as well. Just to be very concrete in terms of opportunities ahead of us, we definitely want to see a better language in the 1267 regime in December, and we want to work on this this fall. The other important rendezvous we see as well is this Counterterrorism 1373 resolution this year, where we also want to see the tech measures type of language appearing. And those will be definitely two very concrete moments where we can see whether or not this pendulum is moving in an interesting direction. Thank
you. Jahangir, anything to add on that second?
No, I quite honestly, I would agree with Naz. The fact is that we don't, when we talk about the expansion of the UN footprint, the fact is that this is not going to, this is going to continue. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it should not be at the expense, that this should be at the expense of also looking at doing, what is done outside of the UN, and particularly the opportunities that are coming up now, as just mentioned, 1373, the 1267 review. These are real opportunities in the context of the 20th anniversary to really infuse precisely this type of dialogue and highlight these issues for member states, because quite frankly, I think we are not having this type of very frank dialogue. It's not front and center with member states, and we are going to continue to have further resolutions, further legislation, whether we like it or not. The UN, the member states are pushing this, and therefore we have to see how best we can engage and make, raise awareness and make sure that these opportunities are actually result in better frameworks.
I think we've got time for one more question before I give the floor over to His Excellency. Got a question from Sharon Harvey of FCDO, which reads, if the onus is on member states to cooperate more and to coordinate better on the CT IHL interface, what do the speakers think this cooperation might look like? Do we need a dedicated international multi-stakeholder forum or platform that focuses on sharing best practice to develop concrete solutions to the challenges we face? Where might this sit and which body might take the lead? If any of you have thoughts on that, maybe if we could go in the order of speaking, Letitia, Naz, and then Jahangir, if you have thoughts you'd like to add on this. And just you could turn your mic off if you want to speak. Letitia, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jake. Well, interesting question. Thank you very much, Sharon, for it. I mean, it could take place in many places. Definitely the Global Counterterrorism Forum, the General Assembly, the Security Council, the Compact. So, I mean, for us, it's definitely a debate that needs to take place in multiple areas and not just in one particular forum. That would be my stake here. But I'll pass it over to Naz for sure. She has something more interesting.
So perhaps it won't come as a surprise that I would recommend kind of moving this out of the CT bodies. So it could be in a meeting of the high contracting parties to the Geneva Conventions that this issue is sort of raised and we think about it. And it could be in a new dedicated space, as Sharon suggests, to thinking about these issues in the context of and under the banner of existing international humanitarian law and commitments to the humanitarian imperative. But I think it's a really important question, and one that I think merits, it's a great area of discussion, I think, for states that see themselves as already perhaps like-minded on these issues, to really think about what does it look like to institutionally implement a space in which these issues can be discussed outside of the context of CT.
Jahangir, would you like to?
Yes, well, I would say that it's all of the above. I mean, we definitely need to have, in the context of inside the UN and outside. I mean, we have, as I explained in my presentation, the largest UN coordination framework that encompasses some 41 UN and non-UN entities, and a number of them are humanitarian agencies. And I have to say that the dialogue that we've been having with humanitarian agencies has been improving. Initially, it was quite tepid, and the humanitarian agencies quite rightly wanted to keep a certain distance because they were concerned about the securitization of their work. And we had to find a healthy balance. I think that we have a lot more work to do in the space within the UN community. The types of dialogues we've been having with our humanitarian partners, whether OCHA or specific agencies like UNICEF, has been improving, but we haven't had a very systematic engagement. And I think at the very least, the various counterterrorism bodies of the UN and the humanitarian actors, including those who are in the field, we need to have a much more focused dialogue, and we have to have a framework, particularly also when it comes to the questions you're asking in terms of implementation of resolutions. Now, that doesn't mean, or it should be at the expense of what Naz was saying, that, it should move out. We should also have that dialogue outside of the UN. And I think that this requires very sustained engagement, both amongst UN agencies, but with member states and also with humanitarian actors. And frankly, it hasn't been happening. It's an imperative, and it's certainly, I think, the value of this discussion definitely puts a focus on a clear need for the way forward.
So, I mean, it sounds like slight differences as to where perhaps the best place is, but regardless of the place, it needs to happen. So wherever there's a basis to initiate that discussion and then perhaps build on it would be worthwhile. We're at quarter till. I don't see any additional questions from the audience, so I'm going to turn the floor over to His Excellency Ambassador Agustin Santos Marave, the permanent representative of Spain to the United Nations, and I should note also the co-facilitator of the global counterterrorism strategy this year. So please, Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this invitation to IPI. As you all know, for the second time, the text was put into a silence procedure and it went through yesterday, 10 o'clock in the morning. You cannot imagine how happy I was and how released of the weight of this task. But at the same time, I have to tell you that I personally learned a lot about this exercise. When we started 4 months ago, the main advice that I received is that don't worry about, just do a technical rollover. And we have been doing technical rollovers in this exercise since the very first text. So probably in a suicidal move, Ambassador Al-Hassan, Oman, and myself decided to try to do something else than a technical rollover. What we have done, I'm not sure, but it is there. So it's for you to read and try to judge. But let me start from the point that say that we are here moving in dark and not very clear areas. From the beginning, the question of interpretation is central. It is central because we cannot imagine at this moment that international humanitarian law is not considered as a principle first step in the whole exercise. Well, from the very beginning, this has been put in doubt, not in this review. It has been put in doubt through the practice, through the CT practice from all member states. And this comes from the 50s and 60s, the Cold War, the counterinsurgency, special laws, you name it. And then when this kind of legacy in our hands, obviously there's a continuous push and pushback about what is the role of international humanitarian law. And obviously some of them try to diminish that role and start putting covenants, to start putting some kind of limits, conditions. For the first time in many years, I came back to the Siracusa principles when they were discussed, the capacity of the state in emergency situations to act in bona fide and not being responsible legally for that. Well, somebody came back to that idea, and that is the symbol of that kind of ambiguous contradiction that for some people is a creativity ambiguity, a creative ambiguity. For some others, it's their life at risk. And from that point of view, let me tell you that the points that were in the 6th review, OP 109 and OP 110 are there with a little increase. That little increase has been mainly on the defense of the medical actions for everybody in any kind of situations. As you all know, this was introduced in our term in the Security Council some years ago, Resolution 2286, and we push it. And I really have to thank member states because I think that if it is there, it's a kind of courtesy to Spain. It's very difficult to say no to the co-facilitator when his own country has pushed one resolution and you don't want to cut it at the end and start this kind of questions. But interpretation is there for resolutions 2462, 2482. And so what do we do? What do we do when we have in some way the legislative capacity of the Security Council, the resolutions, the sanctions committee, and the only thing we have is an ombudsman that tries to deal with this in an individual way. So we have a little principle of interpretation there, a little mechanism of interpretation. One of the things in this review was from the beginning what we can do to try to bring that to the General Assembly, to UNOCT, and to all these kind of things. And we came up with OP 86. OP 86 is a kind of deal between those who wanted to have a strong interpretative mechanism and those who wanted just to have an advisory kind of system inside UNOCT. The question is open. And it will be for member states to decide in 2023 in the next review after the report. What OP 86 does is to ask the Secretary General the Secretary General for his opinion in his report on February 2023 and come up with some kind of ideas in relation with this interpretative aspect that has to be also included in the strategy, in the general strategy. So we will see what happens in these years. The question of data monitoring evaluation. Well, something has come in. And this you can see at the end of OP 92, you have a positive definition of what monitoring and evaluation should be in counter-terrorist institutions linked to the General Assembly. And in OP 93, obviously, we have the question of how to mandate UNOCT to produce, I think the wording is instruments and tools or mechanisms and tools for a result framework. This translates for the rest of humanity, and not only for us who were in this exercise, as a kind of start producing serious scientific criteria about what we're talking about, and then try to establish some kind of statistics and criterion for this. We, as we all know, we are stuck in the convention in relation with terrorist matters. That's the place where we all decided the definition should come up. There's also a mention that it would be good to advance in this kind of process. But what we found out is that it's extremely important to incorporate as much as we can into this debate civil society, starting with discussing with them what is civil society, because there is a lot of opinions about this. What is the legal framework in which it should operate? How it relates to the terrorist questions? Well, this has to be done in a forum, as you pointed out, outside. But then we have the convention also at the same time, and how we do intervene in the conversations and the debate of the terrorist questions. As you know, there's no definition for terrorism. What we have inherited is a negative process of counterinsurgency, mainly from the member states and how it was developed. But let me give you Max Weber's definition, which I think is still valid over there. He defined it as the violence questioning of the monopoly of the violence by the states. And then he added, and the states obviously can only do that, and he went back to Burke in his study of the French Revolution, when they are consensuate, when they have a legitimacy. And that legitimacy, obviously, as we all know, in the last 2-3 centuries has been mainly based on the sovereignty of the citizens in this place. So we have a kind of formula. The less you have consensus, the more you have the questioning of the monopoly of violence. And to be able to reinforce the capacity of convincing everybody of the need to maintain the monopoly of violence, regulate the monopoly of violence, being able to put it under the rule of international humanitarian law, and this was the main function when it was created, then the best way to go through that is reinvigorating the consensus capacity of the state to integrate its citizens and let them have work. If not, we usually have the problem that the monopoly of violence by the state is questioned, and then we have what we call terrorism. And on this situation, I want to end with some kind of hope. I think the 7th review, it's already there. This is work in progress. Many things should have been added. They were not, because it was impossible. The main impression I have is that if we would have 3-4 months more of debate with more forums, with more questions, more things could have been done. Well, now we have 2 years. The question is, are we going to wait until the report February 2023 by the Secretary General, where he will inform us of how we see the situation evolving, or are we continuing our debate that we opened for this review and maintain it open, all the forums and all the questions? My opinion is that we should continue. Thank you very much.
Ambassador, thank you so much. Not least, I know many of our participants were involved in the negotiations. Others have closely followed the negotiations. For those of us that may be watching that weren't as intimately involved, I think you pointing to some of the differences and areas of progress that have been made in the latest version of the GCTS is very much appreciated, and I have no doubt that we'll all be analyzing and closely watching what sort of impact they have, not just on this issue, but across the entirety of the GCTS. And congratulations again on successfully shepherding it through not one, but two silence procedures. So maybe just to close, I wanted to note that today's side event, in a way, is a kickoff of a new project, in some ways itself a continuation of work that we will be doing over the coming year to work with various stakeholders, including member states, very much with an eye towards those on the council, but more broadly with the nonprofit sector, humanitarian actors, as well as the private sector, to try and develop reform proposals that would be acceptable to all as we look ahead to some of the opportunities for progress over the coming year that we've spoken about, including the renewal of the 1267 resolution in December, and the ombudsman and the monitoring team. So more on that to come. With that, I'm going to thank all of our speakers, Ambassador Hoysten, Ambassador Santos, and of course, Letitia, Naz, Jahangir. It was a pleasure to have you with us again, and look forward to having the opportunity soon. So thanks to everybody, and have a good rest of the day.